The year was 2011. The world watched as a wave of protests dubbed the Arab Spring swept across the Middle East and North Africa. In Syria, these demonstrations ignited a conflict that would spiral into one of the most devastating humanitarian crises of our time. More than a decade later, the Syrian crisis continues to inflict unimaginable suffering upon its people and poses a persistent threat to regional and global stability. The sheer scale of the crisis is difficult to comprehend. Millions displaced, countless lives lost, and a nation fractured. The Syrian crisis is not merely a regional conflict, its reverberations are felt worldwide. From the refugee crisis that has strained resources and fueled political tensions in neighboring countries and Europe, to the rise of extremist groups exploiting the chaos, the Syrian conflict has had profound global implications. The conflict has also exposed the limitations of international diplomacy and intervention, raising complex questions about the responsibility to protect civilians and achieve lasting peace. The human cost of this conflict is immeasurable. Behind the staggering statistics lie individual stories of loss, displacement, and resilience. Families torn apart, homes reduced to rubble, and a generation scarred by violence. The Syrian people have endured unimaginable suffering, yet their spirit remains unbroken. This is the story of Syria, a nation grappling with the devastating consequences of a conflict that has shaken the world. It is a story of despair and resilience, of international failures and glimmers of hope. Most importantly, it is a story that demands our attention, for the fate of Syria is intertwined with our own. To understand the Syrian crisis, one must delve into the complex web of historical grievances, political repression and sectarian tensions that laid the groundwork for the uprising in 2011. For decades, Syria had been ruled by the iron fist of the Assad regime, first under Hafez al-Assad and then his son, Bashar al-Assad, who inherited the presidency in 2000. The Assad regime maintained its grip on power through a pervasive security apparatus, suppressing dissent and curtailing basic freedoms. Years of political repression fueled deep-seated resentment among the Syrian populace. The Assad regime's authoritarian rule, coupled with corruption and economic stagnation, created a climate ripe for unrest. The Arab Spring, with its calls for democracy and political reform, provided the spark that ignited the tinderbox of discontent in Syria. In March 2011, peaceful protests erupted in the southern city of Daraa, inspired by the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. However, the Syrian government's response to these protests was swift and brutal. Security forces opened fire on demonstrators, killing and injuring scores of civilians. This heavy-handed response only served to inflame the situation, transforming peaceful protests into armed resistance. As the violence escalated, opposition groups began to form, drawing from the ranks of defected soldiers and ordinary citizens who took up arms against the regime. Adding another layer of complexity to the conflict were Syria's deep-seated sectarian divisions. The Assad regime, dominated by the Alawite minority, faced opposition from a predominantly Sunni population. This sectarian divide, exploited by both sides, fueled a vicious cycle of violence and retribution, further complicating prospects for a peaceful resolution. What began as a popular uprising demanding political reform quickly descended into a brutal civil war, engulfing Syria in a maelstrom of violence and destruction. As the conflict intensified, it drew in regional and international actors, each pursuing their own strategic interests and further fueling the flames of war. The Syrian conflict became a proxy war, a battleground for competing ideologies and regional power struggles. The internationalization of the conflict had devastating consequences for Syria. The United States, along with its allies, provided support to certain rebel groups opposed to the Assad regime, while Russia and Iran emerged as staunch backers of the Syrian government. This influx of arms and funding prolonged the conflict, turning Syria into a chessboard for global powers. As the conflict raged on, extremist groups, most notably ISIS, exploited the power vacuum to seize territory and establish a reign of terror. ISIS's brutal tactics, including mass executions, sexual enslavement, and the destruction of cultural heritage sites, shocked the world and drew international condemnation. The group's rise added a new dimension to the conflict, transforming it from a civil war into a complex, multi-sided conflict with global implications. The Syrian people have borne the brunt of this catastrophic conflict. Millions have been internally displaced, seeking refuge in overcrowded camps or war-torn cities. millions more have fled across borders, seeking safety in neighboring countries and beyond. The humanitarian crisis is staggering, with millions in desperate need of food, water, shelter, and medical care. Despite numerous ceasefire agreements, diplomatic efforts, and international interventions, a lasting solution to the Syrian crisis remains elusive. The conflict has become deeply entrenched, with a multitude of actors, both internal and external, vying for influence and control. The path to peace is fraught with obstacles, but the pursuit of a political solution must remain a priority. The international community has a moral obligation to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people and work tirelessly towards a peaceful resolution. This requires a multi-pronged approach, addressing the humanitarian crisis, promoting political dialogue, and holding perpetrators of war crimes accountable. Firstly, the international community must scale up humanitarian aid and ensure unhindered access to those in need. This includes providing food, water, shelter, medical care, and psychosocial support to millions of displaced Syrians both inside the country and in neighboring countries. Secondly, a genuine and inclusive political process is crucial for ending the violence and forging a sustainable peace. This requires bringing all parties to the conflict, including representatives of the Syrian government, opposition groups, and civil society, to the negotiating table. The international community must play an active role in facilitating dialogue, building trust, and mediating disputes. Finally, there can be no lasting peace without justice. Those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity must be held accountable. This requires supporting international mechanisms for investigating and prosecuting these crimes, as well as promoting transitional justice mechanisms that address past grievances and foster reconciliation. The Syrian crisis is a stark reminder of the devastating human cost of conflict and the urgent need for international cooperation and decisive action. The road to peace will be long and arduous, but the pursuit of justice, accountability, and a future free from violence for the Syrian people must remain a global priority.